Daniel had always been a thrill seeker, the kind of person who thrived on exploring places others avoided. The forest, though thick and seemingly impenetrable, called to him like an unspoken challenge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself at the edge of the woods, a place whispered about in hushed tones by the locals. The villagers had warned him, their eyes filled with unease, that the forest was not a place for outsiders, especially after dusk. Stories of strange disappearances and ghostly voices carried by the wind were told with a seriousness that left a lingering chill in Daniel's mind, but he shrugged it off as local superstition. As he stepped into the forest, the air seemed to change. The usual chorus of chirping insects and rustling leaves was replaced by an oppressive silence. The deeper he ventured, the more the air grew thick, almost tangible, as if the forest itself was aware of his presence. The path was barely visible, swallowed by gnarled roots and creeping vines. Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to dance and twist with a life of their own. He could feel a chill rising, despite the warm evening, and a sense of being watched grew with every step. It wasn't long before Daniel stumbled upon it. The inn. It emerged from the darkened woods like a phantom, its silhouette standing stark against the backdrop of blackened trees. The building looked ancient, its roof sagging under the weight of time, windows broken and dark, yet there was something almost inviting about it, a strange allure that made it impossible for him to turn away. He approached cautiously, the crunch of his footsteps muffled as if the forest floor itself had grown softer, absorbing the sound. A faint light seemed to glimmer from within the inn, though Daniel could see no clear source of illumination. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence, a whisper, almost imperceptible. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest, the beam of his flashlight flickering erratically. The whisper was faint, a voice barely louder than the wind, but it was unmistakable. It called his name. He turned, his breath caught in his throat, but there was no one there. The forest, thick and endless, stood silent and unmoving. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, a cold sweat breaking out as he strained his ears, trying to catch another sound. The voice came again, clearer this time, from the direction of the inn. The door to the inn creaked open, though Daniel had not touched it. It swung inward with an agonizing groan, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. The light he had glimpsed earlier was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Every instinct told him to leave, to turn back and run, yet his feet moved forward, drawn by an unseen force. The air seemed to grow colder as he crossed the threshold, the oppressive silence giving way to a deep, almost rhythmic sound, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. The interior was a maze of forgotten rooms and shadowy corners. The floor was covered in dust, thick enough to leave imprints with each step, yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The scent of damp wood and something metallic, blood, perhaps, lingered in the air. He swept his flashlight across the room, catching glimpses of old, rotting furniture and walls covered in peeling wallpaper. His beam landed on a mirror hung crookedly on the far wall. For a split second, he saw something behind him, a figure, pale and indistinct, before the light flickered and the reflection vanished. His pulse quickened, and he turned sharply, but again there was nothing. The whisper returned, louder now, seeming to come from just beyond the next doorway. It was his name, but distorted, like it was being spoken underwater. Daniel swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was empty except for a single chair, positioned in the middle of the floor, facing away from him. A feeling of dread settled deep in his stomach, an instinctual warning that screamed at him to leave. The shadows seemed to press in around him, thickening as his flashlight began to flicker once more. The whisper had stopped, replaced by an all-consuming silence that made Daniel's ears ring. He stepped closer, his breath echoing in the stillness, and reached out to touch the chair. As his fingers brushed against the worn wood, a sudden, violent force pushed him back, sending him sprawling to the floor. The door slammed shut, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows, their faces obscured, watching. The flashlight rolled away, its beam casting wild arcs of light that only served to deepen the darkness around him. Panic surged through him, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as he scrambled to his feet. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Daniel stumbled backward, his heart pounding, his eyes wide with terror. He had come seeking adventure, but now, standing in the heart of the darkened inn, he realized the truth. He was not welcome here. The forest, the inn, the whispers, they were all connected, all part of something far older and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The air pressed in around him, heavy and cold, and Daniel knew, without a doubt, that he was not alone. Daniel stood in the dim, oppressive darkness of the inn, the whispers still echoing faintly in his ears. His hands were trembling as he picked up the flashlight, its flickering beam barely cutting through the thick, almost tangible shadows. The feeling of being watched had not left him. In fact, it had grown stronger. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with his own ragged breaths. He could feel a weight pressing on his chest, a deep sense of unease that told him he had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. As he moved cautiously forward, the beam of his flashlight fell upon an old painting hung on the wall, a painting that made his blood run cold. The painting depicted a meadow, serene and sunlit, with a single child standing in the middle, her back turned to the viewer. Her dress was familiar, an old-fashioned floral pattern that triggered something in Daniel's memory. He stepped closer, his heart pounding as he took in the details. The long, dark hair, the small figure that seemed so hauntingly familiar. A sudden flash of memory broke through his thoughts. His sister, Emma, running through a similar meadow years ago, her laughter filling the air as she played with her favorite toy, a carved wooden fox. Daniel hadn't thought about that day in years, not since Emma had disappeared without a trace, lost to the forest during a camping trip when they were just children. A chill ran down his spine as he looked at the painting again, his eyes widening as he noticed something he hadn't before. The child's head seemed to have turned, just slightly, as if acknowledging his presence. The hair was parted enough for him to glimpse one eye, a dark, empty void that seemed to swallow the light. He stepped back, the floorboards creaking beneath him, and suddenly he felt it, a sharp pain in his shoulder, like something had brushed against him. He spun around, the flashlight beams slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Only the whisper of the wind outside and the heavy silence of the inn. Daniel's heart raced as he forced himself to turn back to the painting, only to find that the meadow was empty. The child was gone. He stumbled back, his foot catching on something solid, sending him sprawling to the ground. As he scrambled to his knees, his hand brushed against something familiar, smooth carved wood. He picked it up, and his breath caught in his throat. It was the fox, Emma's carved fox, the same one she had held in her hand the day she vanished. The wood was cold, almost icy, and there was a dark stain at its base, a stain that Daniel instinctively knew was blood. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the air growing colder, the whispers louder now, more insistent. They were no longer a mere murmur. They were voices overlapping, some crying, others laughing, all of them filled with a deep, haunting sorrow. Daniel gripped the fox tightly, his knuckles white, as he realized that the inn had not just been waiting for anyone. It had been waiting for him. The memories he had tried so hard to bury were resurfacing, the echoes of Emma's laughter mixing with the eerie whispers that filled the room. He remembered her voice, the way she had spoken of an inn she saw in her dreams, a place she felt she had to find. He had dismissed it as a child's imagination, but now, standing in the very place she had described, he knew she had been right all along. He looked around, the flashlight flickering again, catching glimpses of movement in the shadows. Faces seemed to form in the peeling wallpaper, their hollow eyes watching him, their mouths twisted in silent screams. He could feel the weight of their stares, the accusation in their gaze. The toy fox in his hand grew colder, the chills seeping into his bones, and he could almost hear Emma's voice, faint, distant, calling for him to help her. He had failed her once, letting her wander off into the woods alone, and now it seemed the forest, or whatever dark force resided within it, was demanding something of him, a reckoning for his past mistakes. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, the whispers now a cacophony in his ears. He knew he had to move, to find out what had happened to his sister, and why this place seemed so connected to her disappearance. As he stumbled through the narrow hallway, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows, he felt a growing sense of dread. The inn was not just a building. It was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to feed off his fear, his regret. Every step he took felt heavier, as if unseen hands were trying to pull him back, to keep him from discovering the truth. He came upon a door at the end of the hallway, different from the others, older, with strange symbols carved into the wood, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when he looked at them. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as if urging him to open it. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, a cold breeze seeping through the cracks around the frame, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers, the same flowers that had grown in the meadow where Emma had last been seen. The connection was undeniable, and Daniel knew, deep down, that whatever lay beyond that door held the answers he had sought for so long. With a deep breath, he turned the handle, the door creaking open to reveal a staircase spiraling down into darkness. The cold air rushed past him, extinguishing the flickering light of his flashlight, plunging him into pitch black. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Daniel stood there, at the edge of the descent, his heart pounding in his chest, the toy fox clutched tightly in his hand. He could feel the pull of the past, the weight of his memories, and the sense that whatever waited below was not just a part of the inn, but a part of him, a dark reflection of his own guilt and fear, waiting to be confronted. Daniel stood at the top of the staircase, his heart pounding in his ears, the darkness below stretching out like an abyss. The cold from the open doorway seeped into his bones, and the carved fox in his hand felt heavier, as though it were a burden he could no longer bear. He knew, somehow, that the answers he sought lay below, but the thought of descending into that dark, unknown place filled him with a dread unlike anything he had ever known. Each step seemed to whisper promises of despair, the silence echoing with the weight of countless unseen eyes watching, waiting. As he descended, the air grew colder still, and Daniel felt a pressure around him, an invisible force that seemed to push against his body, urging him to turn back. But the pull of the past, the image of his sister's face, kept him moving forward, each step more difficult than the last. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a cavernous room, lit only by a dim, unnatural glow emanating from the walls, which seemed to pulse like a living thing. The whispers returned, echoing through the darkness, overlapping voices filled with sorrow and malice, and at the center of the room, Daniel saw her, Emma. She stood there, her figure pale and ghostly, her eyes vacant as if she were not truly there. Her dress, the same one from his memory of the meadow, swayed gently despite the stillness of the air. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, tears welling in his eyes. He had spent years trying to forget, trying to convince himself that she was gone, that there was nothing he could have done. But here she was, a ghostly echo of the sister he had lost, and he knew that this was no ordinary reunion. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the room itself was alive with anticipation. Emma raised her hand, and from the shadows, two objects emerged, a key glowing faintly with a warm, comforting light, and an old, tattered book, its cover dark and foreboding. Daniel's eyes flicked between them, his heart sinking as he understood the choice that lay before him. The key seemed to pulse with a gentle warmth, a promise of safety, of freedom. He knew that if he took the key, he could lock away the darkness that had taken his sister, perhaps forever. But there was a cost, a deep, personal cost. The warmth of the key would burn away the memories of her, every cherished moment, every laugh and smile, until nothing remained but an empty space where she had once been. His gaze shifted to the book. The shadows seemed to cling to it, a heavy, dark presence that radiated malevolence. The whispers urged him to take it, promising that its pages held the power to bring her back. He could save Emma, bring her home, but only if he was willing to pay the price. The darkness would not release her freely. He would have to take her place, bind himself to the forest, become a part of the very evil that had claimed her. The thought filled him with a deep, instinctual fear, the idea of losing himself, of becoming a prisoner to the darkness, trapped in the very nightmare he had sought to end. Daniel's mind raced, torn between the impossible choices before him. The weight of his guilt pressed heavily on his shoulders, the memories of that day in the meadow flashing before his eyes, Emma laughing, running ahead of him, her voice echoing through the trees as she called for him to follow. He had let her go, let her wander too far, and now he faced the consequences of his inaction. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, the voices overlapping until they were an unbearable cacophony, filling his mind with doubt and fear. He wanted nothing more than to save her, to bring her back, but at what cost? Could he sacrifice himself for her, knowing that he would be lost forever? Or could he bear the burden of forgetting her entirely, of losing the very essence of who she was? He stepped closer to the key, his fingers trembling as he reached out. The warmth radiated through him, filling him with a strange sense of calm, and for a moment he saw it, a vision of a life without Emma. The laughter, the shared secrets, the love, all of it fading away, replaced by a cold emptiness. The idea of living without those memories, of losing the one connection he had left to his sister, filled him with a deep, aching sorrow. He turned his gaze to the book, the darkness swirling around it, and he knew that to take it would be to embrace the very thing he feared most, to give himself to the forest, to become a part of its twisted, malevolent power. The whisper shifted, the voices taking on a new tone, pleading, begging. Daniel looked up, his eyes meeting Emma's. For a brief moment, her vacant gaze seemed to soften, a flicker of recognition passing over her features. He saw the pain in her eyes, the fear, and he knew that she was still there, trapped, waiting for him to make a choice. Tears blurred his vision as he struggled to breathe, the weight of the decision pressing down on him, crushing him. He could not lose her again, could not let her slip away into the darkness, but the cost of saving her was too great. Daniel fell to his knees, the carved fox slipping from his hand, clattering to the cold, stone floor. The sound echoed through the cavernous room, a sharp, jarring reminder of the reality before him. He closed his eyes, the tears streaming down his face, and he whispered her name. The whispers around him fell silent, the room holding its breath, waiting. He reached out, his hand hovering between the key and the book, his heart pounding, the fear, the sorrow, the love for his sister all swirling within him. He knew that whatever choice he made, there would be no going back. The inn, the forest, the darkness, they would take their due, one way or another. With a deep breath, Daniel made his choice. He grasped the key, the warmth searing through his skin, and he turned towards Emma, his heart breaking. He would save her, even if it meant losing her forever. As he held the key out towards her, the darkness around them roared in protest, the very walls of the room trembling, the shadows recoiling as the light from the key grew brighter, consuming everything. Emma's figure began to fade, her eyes locking onto his, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she mouthed the word, "Thank you." The world around Daniel exploded in light, and then there was nothing. Daniel awoke on the cold stone floor, the key no longer in his hand. The world around him was cloaked in a deep, unsettling darkness, the kind that seemed to pulse with a malevolent intent. The warmth he had felt before was gone, replaced by an icy chill that bit at his skin and gnawed at his bones. He pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, and tried to steady his breathing. The cavernous room was shrouded in shadows, and the dim, unnatural light that had once filled the space had vanished. The silence was absolute, oppressive. But Daniel knew he was not alone. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence that seemed to move just beyond his vision. He took a step forward, his footfall echoing faintly, and the shadows around him seemed to shift, as though they were alive, moving in response to his presence. The whispers returned, faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing moment. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, overlapping voices that spoke in a language Daniel could not understand. They carried a weight, a sorrow that chilled him to his core. He turned slowly, trying to pinpoint the source of the voices, but they seemed to drift through the air, never staying in one place for long. The walls of the room began to change, the stone rippling like water, and Daniel could see faces forming in the dark surfaces, pale, distorted faces with hollow eyes that stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Their mouths moved in sync with the whispers, though no sound came from them. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, the sense of being watched growing unbearable. The faces seemed to press closer, their expressions shifting between sorrow, anger, and something else, something that looked almost like a twisted form of hope, as if they were pleading with him, begging for something he could not understand. Daniel stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold stone wall behind him, and he felt a shiver run through him. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping until they became a cacophony, a deafening roar that filled his mind and drowned out his thoughts. He clamped his hands over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut, but the sound was inside him, reverberating through his very bones. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on him from all sides, and he could feel the shadows closing in, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. Suddenly, the voices stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise had been. Daniel opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and he saw that the room had changed. The walls were no longer stone, but were instead made of gnarled, twisted roots that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The ground beneath him was no longer solid, but instead felt soft, almost alive, shifting under his weight as though he stood on the surface of something that was breathing. The shadows moved between the roots, dark shapes that flickered and twisted, and Daniel could hear a faint rustling, like something moving just out of sight. He took a cautious step forward, the ground shifting beneath him, and the rustling grew louder, the shadows seeming to move in response. He felt a cold breeze brush against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, and he knew that whatever was hiding in the darkness was aware of him. He could feel its gaze, a weight that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The whispers began again, softer now, almost gentle, and Daniel could hear his name, spoken with a familiarity that sent a chill down his spine. The shadows around him seemed to take shape, forming into figures, tall, gaunt shapes that moved with an unnatural fluidity. Their eyes were empty voids, their faces pale and expressionless, and they reached out towards him with long, skeletal fingers. Daniel's heart raced, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground. The figures drew closer, their whispers growing louder, filling his ears with words he could not understand but felt deeply, words that seemed to promise both salvation and despair. One of the figures stepped closer, its face inches from Daniel's. He could see the faint outline of features, the hint of a smile that sent a shudder through him. The figure raised its hand, its fingers brushing against his forehead, and Daniel felt a sudden, overwhelming cold, a chill that seemed to pierce through him, reaching into his very soul. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw something else, a flash of a memory that was not his own. He saw the inn, filled with people, laughter and warmth, the air thick with the scent of food and the sound of music. And then, just as quickly, the scene changed. Darkness, screams, the walls closing in as the laughter turned to cries of terror. Daniel gasped, the vision fading, and he stumbled backward, the figures dissolving into shadows once more. The whispers continued, softer now, almost mournful, and he realized that they were not just voices, they were memories, echoes of the past, trapped within the walls of the inn, bound to the darkness that had taken hold. The realization filled him with a deep, aching sorrow, and he knew that whatever force had taken his sister had not just claimed her. It had claimed countless others, their souls bound to the shadows, their voices lost in the darkness. The ground beneath him shifted again, and Daniel felt himself sinking, the roots wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. Panic surged through him, and he struggled, his hands grasping at the twisting roots, trying to free himself. The whispers grew louder, the shadows pressing in, and he could feel the weight of the darkness, the pull of the past, trying to drag him under. He closed his eyes, his mind racing, and he thought of Emma, her face, her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his. He could not let this place take him, could not let it claim him, as it had claimed so many others. With a surge of determination, Daniel pulled against the roots, his muscles straining, the pain searing through his body. The shadows seemed to recoil, the whispers rising to a frenzied pitch, and he felt the ground beneath him begin to give way. He pushed himself up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and he stumbled forward, away from the grasping roots, away from the darkness that sought to claim him. The figures in the shadows watched, their hollow eyes following his every move, and Daniel knew that the inn, the forest, the darkness, they were not done with him yet. But for now he had escaped, and he would not stop until he had found a way to free his sister, to break the hold this place had on her, and on him. The forest around the inn had grown impossibly dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything it touched, leaving nothing behind. Daniel had managed to break free from the grasp of the roots and escape the twisted underground chamber, but he knew that his ordeal was far from over. The whispers still echoed in his mind, their voices softer now, but no less insistent, and he could feel the forest closing in on him, the weight of unseen eyes watching his every move. He stumbled through the undergrowth, his heart pounding, each step feeling heavier, as though the earth itself was trying to pull him back into its depths. The path before him seemed to twist and change, the trees shifting, their branches like skeletal hands reaching down towards him, blocking his way. He felt his breathing quicken, panic rising in his chest as he realized he was lost. The forest was no longer a place of nature, but a living entity, a maze that moved and changed with a malevolent intelligence, guiding him deeper into its heart. Shadows flickered between the trees, dark shapes that moved with an unnatural grace, always just out of sight. He could hear them, the soft rustle of leaves, the whisper of something brushing against the ground, and he knew they were following him. Suddenly, the air around him grew colder, a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones, and he heard it, a voice, clear and distinct, calling his name. It was Emma, her voice, unmistakable, filled with fear and desperation. Daniel's heart clenched, and he turned, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for her. The voice came again, closer this time, pleading with him, begging for help. He could see her now, a figure in the distance, her pale form barely visible between the twisted trees. She looked just as she had the day she disappeared, her hair blowing gently in a breeze that did not exist, her eyes wide with terror. "Emma," Daniel shouted, his voice breaking, and he began to run towards her. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift and move, roots rising up to trip him, branches snagging at his clothes, but he pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. She was so close, just a few steps away, and he could see the tears streaming down her face, her hand outstretched towards him. But as he reached out, his fingers just inches from hers, she vanished, her form dissolving into the shadows, leaving nothing but the echo of her voice, a fading whisper that seemed to taunt him. Daniel fell to his knees, the cold seeping into his skin, and he realized the truth. This was not Emma. It was the forest, the darkness, playing with him, feeding on his fear, his desperation. The realization sent a shiver through him, a deep, bone-chilling dread that seemed to root him to the spot. The forest was alive, and it knew him. It knew his fears, his regrets, his deepest desires, and it was using them against him. He could feel it, the darkness pressing in, the weight of his guilt, his failure to protect his sister, all of it wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. The shadows around him began to move, shifting and swirling, taking on forms that seemed to flicker between reality and nightmare. He saw Emma again, her face twisted in pain, her eyes empty and accusing. He saw his parents, their faces filled with grief, the blame clear in their eyes. He saw himself, lost alone, the darkness consuming him, and he felt the fear rising, a cold, paralyzing terror that seemed to freeze him from the inside out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices overlapping until they became an unbearable roar, filling his mind, drowning out all thought. Daniel clenched his eyes shut, his hands pressed against his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. He could feel his mind unraveling, the fear, the sorrow, the guilt all crashing over him in waves, pulling him under, and for a moment, he wanted to give in. He wanted to let the darkness take him, to end the pain, the fear, the constant struggle. It would be so easy to just let go, to sink into the shadows, to become a part of the forest, to be with Emma, wherever she was. The thought was a temptation, a dark, seductive whisper that promised peace, an end to the suffering. But then, through the cacophony of voices, he heard something else, a sound, faint but clear. Laughter, Emma's laughter, bright and innocent, a memory from a time before the darkness, before the fear. He saw her face, smiling, her eyes filled with light, and he remembered why he was here. He remembered the promise he had made, to find her, to bring her back, no matter the cost. The darkness had taken so much from him, but it would not take his hope. Not now, not ever. With a deep, shuddering breath, Daniel forced himself to his feet, the whispers still echoing in his mind, the shadows still pressing in, but he refused to give in. He took a step forward, then another, each movement a battle against the weight of the fear that clung to him. The figures in the shadows watched, their hollow eyes following his every move, but he ignored them, his focus on the path ahead. He did not know where he was going, but he knew he could not stay here, could not let the darkness win. The forest seemed to shift around him, the path opening up, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting slightly as he moved forward. The whispers faded, the voices growing distant, and Daniel felt a glimmer of hope, a light in the darkness. He knew that the forest was not done with him, that the darkness would continue to test him, to try to break him, but he also knew that he was not alone. He had his memories, his love for his sister, and as long as he held on to that, the darkness could never truly claim him. The temptation of fear was strong, its pull almost irresistible, but Daniel had faced it and had chosen to fight. He would find Emma, he would bring her back, and he would not stop until the forest, the inn, the darkness, all of it was behind them. The shadows moved around him, still watching, still waiting, but Daniel walked on, his steps steady, his resolve unbroken, and the forest, for now, let him pass. Daniel moved through the forest, his steps echoing with determination, though the darkness clung to him, an ever-present reminder of the malevolent force at play. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, a labyrinth that twisted and turned, the trees bending to form grotesque shapes that loomed over him like silent sentinels. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, he could feel something pulling him forward, an invisible thread that led him deeper into the heart of the forest, where he knew the truth waited. He felt the cold creeping up his spine, the whispers still faintly echoing, and he knew that the forest was preparing for something, that the darkness was not done with him yet. After what felt like hours of walking, Daniel reached a clearing. It was unlike anything he had seen before. A perfect circle surrounded by the gnarled and twisted trees, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dark canopy that blocked out the sky. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, its surface covered in strange, shifting symbols that seemed to writhe and move of their own accord. The air around it was thick, almost suffocating, and Daniel could feel the weight of an unseen presence pressing down on him, a deep sense of dread settling in his chest. He stepped closer, his breath visible in the freezing air, and he saw her, Emma. She lay on the altar, her eyes closed, her face pale, her body bound by thick, dark vines that seemed to pulse like veins. Daniel's heart clenched, a mixture of relief and terror flooding through him. He had found her, but the sight of her lying there, so still, so vulnerable, filled him with a deep, aching fear. He knew that whatever had taken her was close, that this was the moment he had been led to, the moment that everything had been building towards. The whispers grew louder, rising from shadows that circled the clearing, a cacophony of voices that seemed to chant in unison, their words filled with malice and power. Daniel felt his knees weaken, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin as he looked around, the shadows moving closer, their forms flickering and shifting, growing taller, more distinct. He could see faces now, pale, hollow-eyed faces, twisted in expressions of sorrow and rage, their mouths moving with the chant, their voices blending into a single, overwhelming roar. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the earth shifting as though something beneath it was trying to break free. Daniel's gaze returned to Emma, her eyes still closed, her face peaceful, and he knew that this was his moment of truth. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him, the force of the whispers pushing him to his knees, and he realized that the forest, the darkness, was giving him a choice. He could leave, walk away, save himself, and the forest would let him go. Or he could stay, confront whatever force held his sister, and face the consequences. The fear clawed at him, the temptation to run, to escape this nightmare, almost overwhelming. But then he saw her, Emma's eyes fluttering open, her gaze meeting his, filled with fear and hope. The shadows around him seemed to sense his resolve, their forms growing more distinct, more menacing. The chant grew louder, the words now clear, filled with promises of power, of freedom, if only he would turn away. But Daniel knew he could not leave her, not now, not after everything. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and stepped forward, his eyes locked on Emma. He reached the altar, his hands trembling as he touched the dark vines that bound her, and he could feel the darkness within them, a pulsing, living force that resisted his touch. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, the shadows closing in, and Daniel knew he had to act. He remembered the key, the warmth it had given him, the light that had driven the darkness back, and he realized that the light was not in the key, it was within him. He closed his eyes, his hand resting on Emma's, and focused on the warmth of his memories, the love he had for his sister, the laughter they had shared, the promises they had made. He could feel the darkness pushing back, trying to drown out the light, but he held on, his resolve unshaken. A sudden surge of energy flowed through him, a warmth that spread from his chest, through his arms, into his hands. The vines shuddered, their dark surface cracking, the shadows around him recoiling as the warmth grew stronger. Daniel could hear the voices of the shadows, their whispers turning to screams, the faces in the darkness contorting in pain and fury as the light began to spread. He felt the vines loosen, their grip weakening, and he pulled them away, the dark tendrils disintegrating in his hands, turning to ash. Emma's eyes opened fully, her gaze meeting his, tears streaming down her cheeks as the last of the vines fell away. The clearing seemed to tremble, the shadows writhing, their forms dissolving as the light spread, pushing them back, driving them away. Daniel helped Emma sit up, his arms wrapped around her, and he felt the darkness retreating, the cold lifting, replaced by a warmth that filled the clearing, a light that seemed to come from within them both. The chanting had stopped, the whispers gone, and the forest was silent, the oppressive weight that had hung over them lifting, replaced by a deep, calming peace. Daniel looked around, the clearing now bathed in a soft, gentle light, the shadows gone, the dark presence that had haunted them finally driven away. He helped Emma to her feet, her body weak, her legs trembling, and together They turned away from the altar, away from the darkness that had tried to claim them. The path before them was clear now, the twisted trees parting, the way out of the forest open and inviting. Daniel knew that the darkness was not truly gone, that it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance. But he also knew that as long as they held on to the light, as long as they held on to each other, the darkness could never truly claim them. The moment of truth had come, and Daniel had faced it. He had confronted his deepest fears, his guilt, his sorrow, and had emerged victorious. The forest, the inn, the darkness. They had tested him, tried to break him, but he had held on, had refused to give in, and now, as he walked with Emma by his side, he knew that they had won. The shadows of the past were behind them, and though the forest still whispered, still watched, Daniel knew that they were free. For now, that was enough. Daniel and Emma made their way through the forest, the air still thick with an unsettling silence. Although they had escaped the clearing, Daniel could sense that their ordeal was far from over. The oppressive darkness seemed to hang in the air, waiting for its moment to strike. Every rustle of the leaves, every shifting shadow sent a chill down his spine. He held on to Emma tightly, her weak form leaning against him, her steps unsteady. They moved as one, their breaths in sync. The bond between them, the only source of warmth against the cold, malevolent presence that seemed to stalk them. The path led them deeper into the forest, winding and narrowing, the trees growing closer together as if trying to keep them from escaping. The shadows seemed to move with them, growing darker and more pronounced, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. He knew the forest was not done with them, that the malevolent force that had claimed his sister would not let them go without a fight. They reached a clearing, much smaller than the one before, a place where the air felt colder, the ground bare and cracked, as if the life had been drained from it. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its bark dark and twisted, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Daniel could feel the power emanating from it, a deep, pulsing energy that filled the clearing with a sense of dread. He knew that this was it, the heart of the darkness, the source of the whispers that had haunted them, the malevolent force that had taken Emma. Suddenly, the shadows around them began to move, swirling and gathering, taking on forms that seemed to flicker between reality and nightmare. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat as the figures emerged from the darkness. Tall, gaunt shapes with hollow eyes and twisted faces, their bodies shifting and flickering as if they were made of smoke. The air grew colder still, a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones, and he felt the ground beneath his feet tremble, the earth itself seeming to shudder at the presence of the dark entity that was manifesting before them. Emma clung to his arm, her eyes wide with fear, and Daniel could feel her trembling. The figures moved closer, their empty eyes fixed on them, their whispers rising in a haunting chant that filled the clearing. Daniel could feel the weight of their gaze, the power of the darkness pressing down on him, and he knew that they were not just here to frighten them. They were here to take them, to drag them into the shadows, to claim them as they had claimed so many others before. The tree in the center of the clearing seemed to come alive, its branches twisting and writhing, the dark energy within it growing stronger. Daniel could see faces forming in the bark, distorted, twisted faces that seemed to watch him, their mouths moving in silent screams. He knew that this was the heart of the darkness, the source of the malevolent force that had haunted them, and he knew that if they were to escape, they would have to confront it. Daniel stepped forward, his heart pounding, the fear almost overwhelming, but he refused to back down. He could feel the darkness trying to take hold, trying to fill his mind with doubt and despair, but he focused on Emma, on the warmth of her hand in his, on the love they shared, on the promise he had made to protect her. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the trunk of the ancient tree. The bark was cold, almost freezing, and he could feel the dark energy within it, a pulsing, living force that seemed to resist his touch. The whispers grew louder, the figures closing in, their gaunt forms flickering as they moved closer, their skeletal hands reaching out towards him. Daniel could feel the darkness pressing in on him, the weight of the shadows almost suffocating, but he refused to let go. He closed his eyes, focusing on the warmth of his memories, on the love he had for his sister, on the light that had driven the darkness back before. Suddenly, a surge of energy flowed through him, a warmth that spread from his chest, through his arms, into his hands. The dark energy within the tree seemed to shudder, the bark cracking, the twisted faces contorting in pain. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, the figures in the clearing recoiling, their forms dissolving into the shadows as the light began to spread. Daniel could feel the warmth growing stronger, the darkness within the tree weakening, and he knew that they were winning, that the light was driving the darkness away. Emma stepped forward, her hand resting on his, and together they pushed against the tree, the warmth of their combined light spreading through the dark wood, driving out the malevolent force that had taken hold. The clearing seemed to tremble, the ground shaking, the branches of the tree twisting and writhing as the darkness was driven out. The twisted faces in the bark twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, and then, with a final shudder, the tree split open, the dark energy within it dissipating, the shadows dissolving into nothingness. The clearing fell silent, the cold air lifting, replaced by a warmth that filled the space, a gentle light that seemed to come from within the earth itself. Daniel felt the weight of the darkness lift, the oppressive presence that had haunted them finally gone. He turned to Emma, her eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, the warmth of their light surrounding them both. They stood there for a long moment, the gentle light of the clearing washing over them, the shadows gone, the darkness that had tried to claim them finally defeated. Daniel knew that the fight had not been easy, that the darkness had tried to break them, but they had faced it, had confronted their deepest fears, and had emerged victorious. The ancient tree, once twisted and dark, now stood broken and lifeless, its power gone, its dark influence lifted. The forest around them seemed to change, the oppressive atmosphere lifting, the twisted trees parting, the path out of the forest clear before them. Daniel knew that the darkness was not truly gone, that it would always linger in the shadows, waiting for another chance. But he also knew that they had faced it, had defeated it, and that as long as they held on to the light, as long as they held on to each other, the darkness could never truly claim them. He took Emma's hand, their fingers intertwined, and together they stepped away from the broken tree, away from the clearing, away from the darkness that had haunted them for so long. The path before them was open, the forest no longer a place of shadows and fear, but a place of peace, of light. They walked on, their steps steady, their hearts filled with hope, and the forest, for now, let them pass, the whispers silent, the shadows gone. Daniel and Emma emerged from the dense forest, the oppressive atmosphere finally loosening its grip as they reached the edge of the tree-line. They could see the sky now, a deep indigo streaked with the first light of dawn. The warmth of the sun began to touch their skin, and for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, they breathed deeply, the air no longer thick with malevolence. Daniel looked over at Emma, her face still pale, but her eyes filled with life, and he felt a sense of relief washing over him. They had made it out. They had defeated the darkness. But as they walked away from the forest, an unease still lingered in his chest, a nagging feeling that something remained unresolved. They followed a narrow trail that led them to a nearby road, the landscape around them still shrouded in early morning mist. The world felt distant, muted, as if they were in a liminal space between the terror of the forest and the safety of the real world. Each step away from the woods should have made them feel lighter, but the feeling of being watched never truly left them. Daniel could not shake the sense that the forest was still aware of them, still following, a silent presence just out of sight. The whispers had stopped, the figures were gone, but the memory of them lingered, like an invisible weight pressing on his mind. As they reached the road, they spotted a small, run-down gas station in the distance, a beacon of normalcy amid the chaos they had just escaped. The neon sign flickered, the hum of its lights the only sound besides the rustle of leaves behind them. Daniel squeezed Emma's hand, trying to ground himself in the reality of the moment, to convince himself that they were truly free. They approached a gas station, and Daniel caught a glimpse of an old man sitting behind the counter, his eyes half closed as he listened to a small, crackling radio. Daniel pushed open the door, the bell above it ringing out, a sound that made his heart skip a beat, too reminiscent of the inn's bell. He shook off the feeling, reminding himself that they were safe now, far away from the darkness. The old man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in their disheveled appearance. "You two look like you've been through hell," he muttered, his voice gravelly. Daniel nodded, his throat dry, but before he could speak, Emma stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "We need help. We were in the forest, the old inn." At the mention of the inn, the old man's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly, a shadow of fear crossing his face. He leaned forward, his gaze darting to the window, to the forest beyond. "The inn," he repeated, his voice dropping to a hushed tone. "You shouldn't have gone there. People who go to that place, they don't come back." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, the weight of the old man's words sinking in. He wanted to tell him that they had made it out, that they had defeated the darkness, but something in the old man's eyes stopped him. A deep, lingering fear that told Daniel that their ordeal was far from over. The old man stood up slowly, shuffling over to the window, peering out at the forest, his face lined with worry. "That place has been cursed for as long as I can remember," he said, almost to himself. "It doesn't let go, not really. You may have left, but it'll follow. It always does." Daniel felt his heart tighten, a deep unease settling in his chest. He turned to look at Emma, her face pale, her eyes wide, and he knew she felt it too, the sense that they were not truly free, that the darkness still held a part of them. Suddenly, the radio on the counter crackled, the static growing louder, the voices on the other end distorted, overlapping. Daniel's eyes darted to the radio, a chill running through him as he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, his name. He felt his blood run cold, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the old man, whose eyes had gone wide, his face paling. The whisper grew louder, the static intensifying, and Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, the world around him seeming to blur at the edges, the sense of being watched returning with a vengeance. Emma grabbed his hand, her fingers tightening around his, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to go." He nodded, his heart pounding, the whispers growing louder, echoing in his mind, the same voices that had haunted them in the forest. They turned and hurried out of the gas station, the bell above the door ringing once more, the sound sending a shiver down Daniel's spine. They stepped out into the morning light, but the sense of unease only grew stronger, the whispers following them, the feeling of the forest's gaze never leaving them. As they walked away, Daniel glanced back at the treeline, the dark silhouette of the forest standing stark against the rising sun. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing just at the edge of the woods, watching them. He blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling remained, a deep, unshakable sense that the darkness was still there waiting. He looked at Emma, her face set with determination, and he knew that they could not let their guard down, that the fight was not truly over. They had escaped the forest, had confronted the darkness, but the whispers, the shadows, they had left their mark. Daniel could feel it, a cold knot of fear deep in his chest, a lingering presence that refused to fade. The road stretched out before them, the world bathed in the soft light of dawn, but the shadows of the past still clung to them, a reminder of what they had faced, of what still lingered, waiting for another chance. The forest, the inn, the darkness, they were not done with them yet, and as they walked away, Daniel knew that one day they might have to face it all again. For now, they had each other, and that was enough. But in the depths of his mind, in the darkest corners of his thoughts, Daniel knew the truth. the forest never truly let go, and the whispers, though faint, would always be there, calling to them, waiting for the moment when they would return. The mystery remained, the shadows never fully dispelled, and the terror of what lay within the forest will haunt them, a lingering nightmare that they could never truly escape.